This was Mercedes' effort to come back from the single greatest disaster in the history of motorsport. And they went back to where it started. FIA GT1 sports car racing and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In order to do that comeback, they built the CLK GTR. In 1955, a Mercedes 300 SLR was involved in a racing incident at Le Mans, where over 80 spectators were killed, and over 130 more injured. It was the single worst accident in the history of motor racing, and it led to bans around the world, some of which are still carried to this day. It also meant that Mercedes pulled out of all motorsport for decades. In fact, they had no factory involvement in any motorsport at all until 1985, when they partnered with Sauber in the FIA World Sports Car Championship. And even then, it was mainly just Mercedes engines powering the Sauber team. It worked. The Sauber Mercedes C9 was a dominant force in Group C, winning 13 out of the 21 races it entered, including the 1989 24 Hours of Le Mans. And they continued their championship-winning endeavors in 1990, but Sauber withdrew from Group C Le Mans after 1991 with a massive failure on their books. So Mercedes was once again out of the motorsport world apart from touring cars. But 5 years later, two things coincided to launch Mercedes back into the fray. First, that touring car thing was dying because of spiraling costs. And the second one, the exact opposite was happening at Le Mans. The GT1 class was proving immensely successful. The McLaren F1 became the first road car to win Le Mans since 1979, and that got everybody's attention, especially Porsche, who turned the 911 into the 911 GT1 homologation special. And it was a pretty damn good idea, such a good idea that Mercedes looked at it and said, I want to do that. So they called their friends not quite yet family, AMG, and ordered them to build the ultimate GT1 race car and slap a license plate on it. And in order to give themselves an advantage, Mercedes had a trick up their sleeve. They secretly bought a McLaren F1 GTR using a shell company. This allowed them to directly access their competitor tech and lap times, which means they can not only benchmark their progress relative to their competition, they could improve upon their competition and then use those improvements on their own car. Now, this was a unique prospect because this meant that a McLaren F1 actually had a Mercedes V12 in it instead of a BMW V12, and it had Mercedes bodywork stuck onto it. But it worked. AMG went from sketches to a championship contender in just 128 days. That is a ridiculous turnaround time, and it wasn't even a rush job. The final car had an aluminum chassis, carbon fiber tub, carbon fiber bodywork that looked nothing like the CLK it was based on, except for, the grille and the lights, but that's about as much of a silhouette as you can get. And it did not have a BMW V12 like the F1 testbed. No. It had AMG's naturally aspirated V12 making 600 horsepower and 538 foot-pounds of torque. All of this meant that the GTR was ready to race at the start of the 1997 FIA GT1 Championship. And it got off to a bit of a rocky start in the first 3 races, but then they bounced back and won 6 out of the next 8 races, taking the title. And the year after that, they had the car perfected. Out of the 10 races that season, Mercedes won 10 of them. The CLK GTR was so successful that nobody else wanted to play in their pool, and as such, the FIA shut down the GT1 Championship because of lack of competitors. Well done, guys. But Mercedes wanted more. You see, they hadn't actually focused the CLK GTR for Le Mans. So, when the program was announced that it was going to get shut down, they decided to make a CLK GTR for Le Mans, call it the LM. That meant they had to re-sculpt the bodywork to reduce drag, and they ditched the V12 for a more reliable naturally aspirated V8 from their old Sauber C9 program. It was fast, as in 2.5 seconds per lap quicker than the 911 GT1 they had been targeting. But in a cruel twist of fate, their good old reliable V8 had double DNF mechanical failures before lap 40. Ouch. Clearly that stung, because 2 years later, long after the collapse of GT1, the rules were rewritten into the LMGTP class, where manufacturers had free rein to develop the best possible prototype racers. Think of it like the precursor to the LMP1 regulations that we had for the better part of a decade. So, in order to rebound from their abysmal 1998 Le Mans efforts, Mercedes developed the CLR. And it was brand new, except for the fact that the engine and gearbox were from the LM, and the suspension was from the GTR. So it's not really a new car, except for the bodywork, which was substantially different. It was 4 inches lower, 1 inch longer, 2 inches narrower, and the front and rear overhangs between the bumper and the axle was much bigger. By pushing the axles as close together as the rules allowed, the underbody aerodynamics could be bigger, producing more downforce without the cost of drag. And unlike the CLK GTR LM, it had completed over 30,000 miles of testing without a single failure. Now, having won the 1998 GT1 championship, Mercedes got a free spot into the 1999 24 Hours of Le Mans. But some members of the team were expressing apprehension over the Mercedes curse. Because apart from their win in 1952 and their win with Sauber in 1989, Mercedes had a rough track record at Le Mans, with the disaster in 55 and the mechanical woes of the late 80s and early 90s. And 1999 got off to a bad start as well, when suspension failure put a halt to CLR testing. Then, a few hours after they fixed that, Mark Webber was passing an Audi R8R around the Mulsanne corner when all of a sudden the CLR shot up into the air, backflipping before landing on its wheels once again. This actually meant that the car was salvageable, and Webber was fine, so the car was quickly repaired in time for qualifying, thinking it was just a weird fluke. Now, credit to Mercedes, they did consult with the drivers and ask if the car was too dangerous to continue, but apart from a few of their drivers saying the front end goes light over the crest, there were no issues. So Mercedes tweaked the suspension, added some more aero to the front, and it seemed to work. Dumbreck's CLR started 7th, and even Webber's rebuilt CLR started 10th. Then, during the warm-up with 2 hours before the green flag drop, Webber's car took off again over the Mulsanne hump. And again, Webber was fine, but his race was over well and truly before it could even begin. And again, Mercedes tweaked the front of the CLR with more canards and aerodynamics to try and improve stability. And again, it seemed to work, as Dumbreck was running within the top 10 after 75 laps. But then, as he was in the Toyota GT1 slipstream, he crested Indianapolis and took off into the sky once again in full view of the cameras, flying dozens of feet into the air, somersaulting over the fence and into the trees. By some miracle, he landed in the middle of an open field surrounded by trees and not actually in the trees, which meant Dumbreck was fine, but it was the final nail in the coffin and Mercedes retired from Le Mans, and they haven't come back since. So what the heck was the cause of all of these flights? Well, remember those overhangs I was telling you about for the underbody aerodynamics that were massive and way longer than any other car on the grid? Well, those are great for top speed and they're great for high-speed cornering. But when you're cresting a hill, especially in the dirty air behind another car, the suction between the downforce elements and the ground can break, and the downforce quickly becomes upforce. In the end, the CLR accidents led to the rules regarding overhangs to be completely rewritten, and the hills at Le Mans were smoothed out by 26 feet. And as I mentioned, we have not seen a Mercedes at Le Mans since. But the great irony is, apart from that rather big flaw of unexpected flight, the CLR was actually a pretty damn good car to drive. It was praised by its drivers for incredible handling, control, and the technology it provided. But regardless, the CLR changed Le Mans forever, and it's one of the most spectacular moments in 120 years of motorsport history. Now, so far, everything I've been talking about is for the FIA GT1 class racing car. But remember, per GT1 class rules, you had to build road versions, or as the Germans called them, Strada versions. Porsche made some, Nissan made one, Toyota made one, and maybe half, I don't know. Lotus made one, but Mercedes actually made a production run of 26, plus 2 prototypes, 20 coupes, and then 6 roadsters. They weren't cheap, they were the most expensive cars in the world at the time at $1.5 million in 1998 money. But what you got was one of the truest examples of a race car for the road. A 7.3 liter naturally aspirated AMG V12, 604 horsepower, 214 mile an hour top speed, a 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. Those are impressive figures today, much less almost 25 years ago. And unlike a lot of cars these days, which are race cars for the road, but aren't really, this was. Not only was the performance blistering, but it looked like the Le Mans car. It genuinely looked like it, even down to the removal of the body panels. You didn't just pop the hood, you took the pins out and you took the entire front end, took the entire back end off. It just came apart. And the ground clearance is atrocious. It has a ridiculous amount of horsepower to the rear wheels. Sure, it has traction control and fancy seats, but you sit very low. It's incredibly wide. There's virtually no luggage space. It's probably the most dangerous CLK GTR short of the sister car, the CLR, that Mark Webber flew off in. It's an incredible machine, and this stays true for both the road car and the race car. It's a machine that will likely never exist again. These rules simply do not exist anymore. The FIA hypercar class technically exists, it technically works as a successor to GT1, but everybody is just using the new IMSA rules instead of the FIA rules. So it's not necessarily building anything like the 911 GT1, like the F1 GTR, or the CLK GTR, which is by far the most extreme of the trio. And I think that is a good message for the entire CLK CLR journey. They were the extreme. They were so extreme it led to a complete change of the rules. It was incredibly spectacular on the road, on the track, or in the air, and it achieved racing records that few cars will ever be able to match. It was an absolute brute. And it had such a long-lasting legacy that even when the AMG 1 came out, there was extreme pressure for Mercedes to enter it in the Le Mans hypercar class. And they have since rebuked those claims, saying that sure, it fits within the hybrid protocols and regulations that have been presented, they're not going to enter it and focus on their Formula 1 team instead. And with hindsight looking back on everything, that might be the best thing for everybody.